And the story of the oven of Achnai is probably one of the stories that has gotten the most commentary on. I think because it's like a key story about what's going on in the heads of the rabbis during the time of the Talmud. I think also in looking at this story, like many of the other particularly long stories in the Talmud, my approach is it's not that there's one moral of the story, but rather that the story is there to raise questions, to present conflicting values, sometimes to challenge what is presented before and or after in terms of what the normative halacha is. So, for example, in terms of Purim, you may have heard this story that that there's a statement in the Gemara that you're supposed to get so drunk on Purim that you can't tell the difference between Haman and Mordechai. That is immediately followed by a story about two rabbis who got so drunk that one of them killed the other one and had to rely on a miracle to resuscitate him. Clearly, the Talmud is juxtaposing this black line halachic story with, hey, wait a minute, it's not so clean. You got to take it at least with a grain of salt, and there's some nuance here. And I think the same thing is true about many of the Talmud stories, particularly perhaps the Oven of Achnai. This is a really rich story that practically every line has some kind of symbolism to it. And some of them have been written about by many people. Some of them I haven't really seen much about, what's this detail doing here? And so if you guys have ideas, that would be great. But it proves that there's still more to plumb the depths of this story. So how do we start? The story starts about a disagreement between Rabbi Eliezer and the sages. Sometimes I refer to them as the rabbis, over a technical issue about a stove, an oven. There's this oven that's made of clay tiles that are held together just by sand that sort of packs them in. So it's not a full oven. They're not soldered in any way. They can easily be dismembered, but somehow it stays together as an oven. And the question that they debate is it pure or impure? And should have said the story is found in Talmud Bavli in Bava Metzia. You got the source on the source sheet up there on the screen, 59A and B. And I'm going to just read the English and sort of interrupt periodically to comment. And if you guys have things to say, feel free to interrupt also. So the story starts. We learned elsewhere, quote, if he cut it into separate tiles and put sand between each tile, Rabbi Eliezer ruled it was pure, tahor, and the sages ruled it was impure, tameh. And this was the oven of Achnai. What is the oven of Achnai? Rabbi Yehuda said in Shmuel's name, because they surrounded either it or him with words like a snake and declared either it or him impure. So because Hebrew is a gendered language, it doesn't have a word for it. And so when the Gemara is talking about this, it's not clear if what's being surrounded is the oven, and the idea is that it's being just discussed a lot. It's being surrounded with words, or it means him and it's Rabbi Eliezer, and the rabbis are sort of surrounding him. And the fact that they talk about surrounding it like a snake is, in its most benign sense, it just means they out-argued him. But when you think of, like a boa constrictor that circles around and squeezes the life force out of you, maybe that's what's being suggested here, that's what the rabbis were doing to Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, looking at part B of the story. It was taught. On that day, Rabbi Eliezer brought all the arguments in the world, but they did not accept them from him. So he's trying to use their rules. He's arguing logic, but it's not working. So he goes to plan B. He said to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my position, let this carob tree prove it. The carob tree was uprooted from its place 100 cubits, and some say 400 cubits. They said to him, we don't bring proof from a carob tree. He again said to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my position, let the stream of water prove it. The stream of water flowed backwards. They said to him, we don't bring proof from a stream of water. So he's clearly using miracles to support his opinion, and the narrator is suggesting to us here that God is on his side. God is showing that, yeah, objectively, Rabbi Eliezer is right. But the rabbis are saying that's not the rules of the game. Miracles are no longer relevant here. We decide halacha according to the way the rabbis have agreed to decide halacha, logic and reasoning and analogies. And the fact that there are miracles going on is irrelevant to persuading us. But it's also interesting to note that both the water and the tree are symbols of Torah, and they're both being uprooted by nature, I guess, at the behest of Rabbi Eliezer. And again, there's some ambiguity here as to what the narrator is trying to tell us. On the one hand, you could say Rabbi Eliezer is accusing the rabbis of uprooting the system because they're just wrong and they're insisting that they're right when they shouldn't be. Or you could see it as Rabbi Eliezer is uprooting the natural order of majority rule, which is how halacha is now being determined. So, something's being uprooted, but we're not sure what the narrator thinks that is. Okay.
Gloria,
Part
may I
C.
interrupt you? Gloria?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Now the question is, does Joseph interpret the dreams of the Pharaoh, or does God enable Joseph to interpret the dreams of the Pharaoh? In other words, does Rabbi Eliezer cause these miracles, or does God enable Rabbi Eliezer to cause these miracles?
I kind of think when we're talking supernatural, that's God going on. For sure with Rabbi Eliezer, in terms of Joseph, whether you call it, directed by God or intuition coming from God, I don't know, but that's not really what we're talking about. So let's shelve that question.
Okay.
Okay, so now we're back to Rabbi Eliezer, and he says, if the halacha is in accordance with my position, let the walls of the Beit Midrash prove it. And on its most literal meaning, the Beit Midrash is the study hall, the actual physical location where they're meeting to decide halacha. But in this story, it's also a metaphor for the whole process of the way the rabbis are determining halacha. And the walls of the Beit Midrash lean to fall. So it's interesting here that with all of them, Rabbi Eliezer isn't saying this is what I want to happen. He's just saying, let these things prove that I'm right. He's not saying, let the walls collapse. He's saying, let the walls show that I'm right. And it's not even clear that he understands before he says it what the consequences are going to be. Yet the wall's starting to collapse. That pretty clearly reflects the idea that the system is about to fall apart. The building is caving in. The structure can't hold if he's calling on miracles as opposed to working within the system. Going back to our text, So as the walls are coming down, Rabbi Yehoshua scolded them. He said, if sages fight with each other, and the word is menatzchim, over halacha, what's it your business to interfere? They, meaning the walls, did not fall on account of the honor of Rabbi Yehoshua and did not become straight on account of the honor of Rabbi Eliezer, and they still remain inclined. So we have here, I think, a foreshadowing of one of the key themes of this story, that dignity is important here. And you could almost say the walls are more sensitive to the feelings of people than the actual people in the story are. So let's kind of keep that in mind. And just to put this in context, the story doesn't come in a vacuum. The story comes in a part of the Talmud that's talking about damaging people with words, how you can hurt people with words. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. But that's why I think this idea of dignity is foreshadowing more to come.
Gloria?
Back to the text. Yeah.
Gloria? Hi.
Yeah.
The idea that objects have dignity and thereby demonstrate that everybody deserves dignity is a fairly common, not an uncommon theme, insofar as I remember a thing. So, for example, we cover up the phallus. We do other things because of the dignity of objects, thereby saying if objects, have dignity, kal v'chomer, humans. That's sort of.
Yeah, but here it's not that the walls have dignity, it's that the walls recognize the dignity of the individual rabbis. And so if one rabbi is saying fall and one is saying don't fall, they want to make both of them feel not rejected, and so they stay tilted in. So it's not that the walls have the dignity so much as that the walls appreciate the dignity.
Gloria, may I interrupt you
Sort
again?
of like the story, the song,
Gloria?
the Naomi Shemer song Hakotel,
Gloria,
Yeah.
I want to interrupt you again because you're talking here about what's rhetorically called personification, or inanimate
Okay.
objects that act like animate objects or human beings. And that
Okay.
is the religion of animism. And animism is what we find with the snake and the talking donkey and the burning bush and many, many other concepts and incidents in Judaism. If it is animism, that means that God is embedded in the world and that we are embedded in God. So you have here a situation in which you're talking about human beings that have power. But if the religion is animism, then human beings might not have power at all. And then
Well, I'm
I'm
not
saying
sure that you have to say that that the religion has animism, as opposed to that there are times for literary reasons that animals or objects are given human type powers. And again, I don't think we have to get into that deeper level of what is the religion all about. That may be too broad a generalization, certainly for here.
Well, I'm suggesting is that there are two lenses operating here, really maybe three. But there's a lens of the academic scholar of Judaism, and there's the lens of the rabbi of Judaism. I think you were very effectively and very wonderfully standing for the rabbinic position. Am I correct?
I think I am trying to reflect both the rabbinic position and the academic position. And I think we don't have to go into characterizing the religion as animism in order to appreciate what's going on with this story. That may be for
But
another time and
I could
a far
also,
deeper
right,
kind of
right.
discussion.
I am often accused of tangentiality, of comparative, of horizontal thinking, comparative thinking, and that's the way I think. Okay, and I
Okay,
think
why
that
don't we hold the tangential stuff till the end, to make
okay,
sure we
well,
have enough time to get through the
I
story,
I have
okay?
to go. I have to go to an IDF briefing on the war, and I'm going to try to stay as long as I can. But I may not be here at the very end.
Okay, well, if you could try to temper your
Will do.
comments to be a little
Okay.
bit more directly relevant.
Okay.
Okay, so after all of the business with the walls, Rabbi Eliezer again says, if the halacha is in accordance with my position, let heaven prove it. And a bat kol, a heavenly voice, comes out and says, what's your problem with Rabbi Eliezer? The halacha is always in accordance with him, which is a grossly unnecessary generalization, but so be it. Rabbi Yehoshua rose to his feet and said, it, meaning the Torah, is not in heaven. The language that we so often hear about, lo bashamayim he. And then we get a little digression in the story. This is part E. What does it mean it is not in heaven? Rabbi Yirmiyah said, since the Torah has already been given at Mount Sinai, we pay no attention to a bat kol, because you, meaning God, have already written the Torah. One must incline after or abide by the majority. And so what Rabbi Yirmiyah is saying is, what God thinks the halacha is doesn't matter anymore, because God, through the Torah, has given the sages the authority to interpret the Torah, and now the majority of the rabbis can determine halacha, and God's views are nice to have, but not binding as halacha. And then we get Rabbi Natan met Elijah the prophet and said to him, what was the Holy Blessed One doing at that time? He said, God was laughing and said, my children have defeated me. Nitzchuni, the same root from the rabbis are fighting with each other. My children have defeated me. And the typical interpretation here is the rabbis are viewed as defeating God because they're declaring the halacha is something that God would not have said. On the other hand, God is laughing. It's sort of like a parent who's proud of a child who just, beat them in a chess game or something. That this is God being proud of where the rabbis have come to. And the defeat is not being upset with them, but rather, happy about where they've come to. But Rabbi Shlomo Riskin has another take on this line. And he notes that the word nitzchuni could also be related to the word lanetzach, meaning forever. And so his take is, what's going on here is God is saying, my children have made me eternal, that because the halacha can evolve and is not static, it can be responsive to human needs, adapt to human conditions, and that's what makes halacha continue to be relevant throughout the generations, which I found to be really a powerful way of reading that line. Okay, so many people think the story ends here. There's a vindication of the rabbi's right to decide halacha. But really the story keeps going. There's a part 2, which raises some questions about that. But before we look at that, let's kind of take stock of where we are in the story. The story seems to be about the nature of the legal process, how halacha is determined, and it can be seen as a conflict between the law as determined by God versus the law as determined by a rabbinic majority based on logic and debate. And the two main protagonists here, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua, are frequently portrayed as sort of representing these two aspects of law. Rabbi Eliezer, in many places, is portrayed as he's the guy who has the received tradition. He knows what has been passed on, from God to Moses, all the way down the generations, through his teachers to him. And it's a very stagnant kind of law, but it's directly, well, through the chain coming from God. Whereas Rabbi Yehoshua is more a believer in innovation in halacha, the ability to determine halacha based on logic, and the fact that halacha is meant to be evolving. And in fact, this conflict between these two figures, which comes up in a number of stories throughout the Talmud, is probably reflective of a real issue during the Talmudic period. Because when you think about what's going on right after the destruction of the temple, you've got the rabbis who are trying to figure out, what do we do to keep this religion going? It had been very temple centric, and now there's no temple. We have to move it into a religion that's based on prayer and based on study. We have to innovate because the central piece is gone. And so this conflict of, innovation versus no, we have no right to innovate is really important to the rabbis at that time. And a story like this and many of the other stories in the Talmud are playing that out. In a way, you sort of suspect that the rabbis are trying to prove to themselves and maybe to a wider audience that they're doing the right thing here. And there's maybe this insecurity. Are we really doing the right thing or not? And so we've got this story to sort of help work through that conflict. And it's interesting that the oven can also be seen as about this kind of a debate. The rabbis are saying in order for the oven to be pure, it has to be unified, monolithic. There's no room for debate. It's got to be, once the majority determines what the law is, that's it. There's no room for minority opinions. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer, even though he believes that he is right, he doesn't seem to be telling the rabbis, and you can't believe what you want. There's room in his philosophy, perhaps, to say, I can be right and you can be right, and we can together with these various pieces still make up a unified whole that has components as opposed to that's totally solidified together. And just to, focus a little bit on Rabbi Eliezer here, he's trying to stand up for what he thinks is right, but he's also causing a tremendous amount of damage by refusing to back down and by refusing to even state, you can have your view and I can have my view and we can live together, which is what the oven is saying. But we don't hear it from the words of Rabbi Eliezer. And he's not playing by the rules. He's calling on miracles as opposed to logic. And the combination of those two is causing the system to fall apart. And so what he's doing is pretty drastic. It it brings the whole rabbinic program sort of to an area where maybe it's not clear if it can survive. Because if he's going to be allowed to continue this way and the walls are going to collapse, then what's left of the rabbinic project? Okay, getting back to our story, we now get to part 2, and we're now in F in the source sheet. It was said, on that day, they brought all the objects that Rabbi Eliezer had declared pure and burned them in the fire. And they took a vote and excommunicated him. So I think my first impression to this is, my gosh, this is just overkill. They didn't have to do all that. They could have also said, okay, you keep to your view, we'll keep to our view. I mean, we're talking about an oven. You know, how horrible is it to have two standards about an oven? On the other hand, you know, to see this from the rabbi's perspective, it could be that they just feel this is necessary to preserve the system. Okay, so having excommunicated him, now in G, they say, who will go and tell him? Rabbi Akiva says, and Rabbi Akiva is one of his students, I will go, lest the person who is not fit go and tell him and end up destroying the whole world. So Rabbi Akiva already has a premonition that if Rabbi Eliezer has the news provided to him in the wrong way, that in itself could create more destruction. What did Rabbi Akiva do? He put on black garments, wrapped himself in black, and sat 4 cubits away from him. So black is a sign of mourning, of avelut, and the 4 cubits away is a sign of excommunication. So he's like showing rather than telling, and letting Rabbi Eliezer sort of come to it in his own time frame. Rabbi Eliezer said to him, Akiva, how is this day different from other days? Meaning, why are you doing what you're doing here? He, meaning Rabbi Akiva, said to him, Master, it seems to me that your colleagues are separating themselves from you. So again, that's the most gentle way you could say it. He wouldn't use the word excommunication. He's trying to, you know, let him know what's happening, but in as gentle a way as he can. Then he, Rabbi Eliezer, also tore his garments, took off his shoes, and sat on the ground while tears flowed from his eyes, which seems to say Rabbi Eliezer is accepting the situation, but he's very hurt. And at this point, we don't see anger, we just see hurt. H. The world was then smitten. 1/3 of the olive crop, 1/3 of the wheat, and 1/3 of the barley were destroyed. And some say even the dough in women's hands swelled up and was spoiled. It was taught, great was the destruction that occurred on that day, for everything that Rabbi Eliezer looked at burned up. And again, sometimes burning is a sign of passion or anger, but I think here the prevailing emotion is just pain. We can also see this as a kind of midah keneged midah, a quid pro quo. They burned the things that Rabbi Eliezer said were pure, that they said were not pure, but now everything else is burning up. And now the scene shifts to Rabban Gamliel, who was absent from the first scene in the Beit Midrash, but he is the Nasi. He's the head of the Sanhedrin. He's the head of the chief religious court. and he is ultimately the person behind the excommunication. And in other stories, he is personified as an autocrat. He doesn't tolerate dissent. There are a number of stories where he is juxtaposed with Rabbi Yehoshua. And in a very famous story in the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah, they're debating whether which day is the right day for the new moon and of Tishrei, and therefore which is the right day for Yom Kippur. And Rabban Gamliel says, you, Rabbi Yehoshua, are going to prove to the world that you give in to my view. You're going to come to me on the day that you say is Yom Kippur with your money bag and your traveling stuff, and thereby demonstrate that you're giving in to my view. And Rabbi Yehoshua agonizes over this for a long time and ultimately gives in. He basically says, this is not something that I want to fight about, that the value of preserving a single unified calendar for the Jewish people is more important than me continuing to make the claim that I'm right. And so we've got that sort of in the back of our head from having learned that story in the Talmud. And that's sort of indicative of the character of Rabban Gamliel. So now getting back to our story in part I. Rabban Gamliel was traveling in a ship when a huge wave rose to drown him. He said, it seems to me that this is happening only on account of Rabbi Eliezer ben Harkanos. He rose to his feet and said, Master of the universe, it is revealed and known to you that I did not do this, meaning have Rabbi Eliezer excommunicated, for my honor or for the honor of my father's house, but rather for your honor, so that conflicts, machlakot, should not increase in Israel. And then the sea rested from its churning, from its anger. And I think this little vignette here seems to be pointing out that at least after the fact, Rabban Gamliel realizes that maybe there was a problem with what he did. Maybe it was an overreaction. But he still feels that on the whole, he did the right thing. And the sea, which is reflecting God's view, seems to agree with his statement. But it's not clear from this part of the story whether this is God's approval of his actions or just agreeing that his motives were pure. I think by the time we get to the end of the story, it seems more likely that God is not agreeing with his actions. But at this point, it just raises the question. Now the scene shifts again to Rabbi Eliezer's home. We're in J now. Tima Shalom, the wife of Rabbi Eliezer, was the sister of Rabban Gamliel. From that time on, she would not allow Rabbi Eliezer to fall on his face, meaning to say Tachanun. Tachanun is one of these prayers that is, pour out your heart and ask for God's compassion. And Ima Shalom realizes that if Rabbi Eliezer has a chance to express his anger, that will have bad consequences. And so she's trying to prevent him from saying Tachanun. And it seems that for a while she's successful, but the story doesn't tell us the details of how she managed that. Instead, in part K, we look at a time when she fails to prevent him from saying it. One day it was Rosh Chodesh, and she mistook a full, meaning a 30-day month, for a defective, meaning a 29-day month. So she thought that it was a day when Tachanun wasn't being said, so she didn't have to do whatever it is she normally did to prevent him from saying it. Some say a poor man came and stood at the gate. She brought out some bread to him. So under this version, she just wasn't around. She was busy doing a mitzvah of dealing with the poor person, and so couldn't prevent him from saying Tachanun. On her return, she found that Rabbi Eliezer was saying Tachanun. She said to him, "Get up, you have killed my brother." Meanwhile, a shofar blast went out from the house of Rabban Gamliel announcing his death. Rabbi Eliezer said to her, "How did you know?" She said, "I have this tradition from my grandfather's house. All heavenly gates are locked except for the gates of verbal oppression." And so it's interesting that Rabbi Eliezer, who is so focused on the received tradition and everything he knows comes from tradition, here his wife has a tradition that he doesn't know about. And we can maybe talk a little bit about that later. So at this point, the focus of the story seems to be, and it's sort of the culmination of all of part 2, that this is a story about harming somebody with words, hurting their feelings. And the lead into the story, as I mentioned before, talks about ona'at dvarim, types of speech that can cause embarrassment or pain. And it gives some examples, reminding people of shameful things they did in the past, or intentionally providing misinformation, or, for example, leading a shopkeeper to think that you're going to buy something when you have no intention of buying. So then they feel, gee, maybe they did something wrong, that they lost the sale. It could include calling someone an embarrassing nickname. And in the discussion, they talk about how bad embarrassing somebody is. They talk about it's worse than monetary wrongdoing, because if you hurt somebody with money, you can make good, you can pay them back. But once you hurt somebody with words, there's no way to take back the harmful words. And they even say embarrassing somebody is tantamount to murder. So we've got this buildup for the story of that now makes us realize kind of how awful what the rabbis did to Rabbi Eliezer. And so we've got, I think, 2 conflicting values here. We've got this sense of the rabbis really did something wrong by overreacting, by hurting him, by giving him so much pain, and it ultimately, reflects on the damage that's done to the world, and ultimately the damage that's done to Rabban Gamliel. On the other hand, you've got the story of Rabban Gamliel on the ship, which suggests maybe these are just consequences that had to happen, but that the actual act of excommunicating him was necessary in order to preserve the system. And you've got these 2 conflicting values. And I think that part of what's going on in this story is to force us to think about, what do you do when there's somebody harming the system? At what point can you say we can tolerate dissent? And at what point do you say, no, we have to put our foot down and say, this is unacceptable? And how far do you go? And I think that is a common aspect that we see even today. And that's part of why we have all these schisms, both within Orthodoxy and between Orthodoxy and the more liberal Judaic movements. And it's like, where do you draw the line? Where do you say we have a big tent, everybody can be in the tent, we have different values? And where do you say, nope, you've gone too far, we don't excommunicate people anymore, but we can sort of declare you outside of Orthodoxy? So, for example, I don't know, when the conservative movement came out with you can drive to shul on Shabbat, I think the Orthodox movement said, okay, no, we're drawing the line there. We can't deal with that. Mechitza became another one of these dividing lines, even though before the sort of schism, it was a lot more amorphous. And there were many shuls that were sort of so on Mechitza. And then with Reform, you've got the patrilineal descent, where I think you can make a much stronger case that may be totally undermining our system, because over the generations, we're growing Jews who maybe aren't even halachically Jewish anymore. So it's a live issue that is being raised in this Talmudic story. And I guess I'd like to step back and hear what you guys have to say about the story and about the issues raised. Yeah, Lance.
Okay. I must tell you that I've read this story many times, and thanks to you, I see something right now that I had not thought about ever before this. And that is the poor man. The poor man is the key to this story, because without the poor man, Ima Shalom would continue to keep her brother alive. It's only when the poor man shows up, right, that this whole thing ends. Rabbi, the head of the rabbis, the man who obviously was ultimately responsible for excommunicating Rabbi Eliezer, dies. And also want to just, if you don't see that, you can look at the story of Rabbi Rahumi, Rabbi Love. Same thing happens. But anyway, the point here is that the poor man is an angel of the Lord, just like the Ish is an angel of the Lord in the story of Joseph. Joseph is on his way to Dohan, but he comes to a fork in the road and he doesn't know which way to go. And this anonymous gentleman magically appears and tells him which way to go. Now, if he doesn't go that way, there's no Judaism, there's nothing, right? He goes off, the brothers go their way, and that's the end. However, the Ish makes certain that Joseph goes his way. And at the very end of the story, Joseph says to his brothers, you threw me into the pit. You wanted to kill me. Don't worry about it. It was not your fault. You're not responsible. God set the whole thing up. Now, that's the way I see this. I could give you a historical thing and say that the oven represents the Kohanim, Rabbi Eliezer represents the Kohanim, and the rabbis don't like Kohanim, and the Kohanim are not allowed to be any part of the ritual. And the other thing I'd like to emphasize is that anyone who does not follow the oral law, but follows the Torah, follows the Tanakh, is not considered a Jew in Rabbinic Judaism. I'm talking about the Karaites. I'm talking about the Ethiopian Kesach. I'm talking about the Samaritans. And I'm talking about the Messianic Jews. These are all Jews as far as I'm concerned, but Rabbinic Judaism does not. And also, I forgot to mention the Nigerian Jewish Igbo. But all these outsiders are not considered proper Jews. The other thing is, if you have a mechitza, it's supposed to be a proper mechitza, isn't it? So that the men cannot see any part of a woman. Not true at the bayit, is it? Not true at
I don't think that's necessarily the correct halacha. I think there are various views about that. My understanding is that when Rav Avi put up the mechitza in the bayit, he expressly got the permission of the Rav in terms of the height of the mechitza. And so that there is at least a view that that height mechitza is sufficient. Yes, there are views that it has to be, so high up that nobody can see on either side. And in fact, there are places where, for example, in Sfat, there are some shuls where the women are davening actually in a separate room where they're not at all visible and they can't see what's going on.
In my hometown, we had a balcony.
Okay, so I just want to bring in another aspect, if I may, and allows other people to participate. I think it brings up a lot of what, like you said before, what the world is like today, in terms of the how your worldview and how you view certain things. And I think that the ship, when Rabbi Eliezer was on the ship, what was it, Rabbi Gamliel?
Rabbi
was on the
Gamliel.
ship, yeah.
Yes.
I think Hashem was telling him that that it's more important. I like what you said about the lashon hara, about not embarrassing. What's more important, the digging your heels into the ground, or without respecting other people? I think it's, what's more important, our relationship between us and God. But even on Yom Kippur, it says our relationship between each other is more important. I think it leaves a lot of questions about what is right and where do we draw the line. I don't think it answers anything. I think
Tova,
It's
if I
not
may,
supposed to answer anything. It's supposed to raise the questions and have us thinking about it. And I think this story does a very good job of that.
there is an Orthodox rabbi in Israel who will not permit the Gaboim to correct the Torah reader because the rabbi says that is a humiliation and it is murder. So you can take any of these things, you can take anything you want, and as I'm doing, play with it and say, this interpretation is one way, that interpretation another. There's a literary critic, or was, named Roland Barthes, who has an article called The Death of the Author. And what he says is that the authorial intention, we don't know, but we have our interpretations. And if you go to Rob Stevens' class, you will find that there are many, many, many interpretations of every parsha. You go to Rob Stevens' class on the prophets, many, many interpretations of Ezekiel, for example. And it's great. I mean, I'm not saying this is bad. I'm not saying, I think, Tova, I think you're right. I think you're good. It's good. Gloria, I think you're right. It's good. All this discussion is really good. But the problem I have is there is no absolute and correct answer. All you can do is questioning and answering. That is Charles W. Kingsfield Jr. in The Paper Chase. And I really have a problem with anyone who says, I'm right and everybody else is wrong. And that's essentially what Hamas says. Anyway, I got to go.
And okay, I agree with you that the questioning is more important. And frequently we are, even today, struggling. One of the big issues that comes up, for example, is when our contemporary moral, ethical sensibilities disagree with where halacha seems, or where the Torah seems to be pointing us. And many contemporary people have struggled with that question. Rav Lichtenstein has a fairly famous essay where he's talking about the Akedah and what do you do when your moral sensibility is different from the halacha. And he says, ultimately, you have to acknowledge that there's a tension there. and that you don't have the ability to figure it out now. And you have to hope that over time, humankind will develop to get a sense of what it is that God really wants in these circumstances. And he concludes that for him, you agonize and and you try very hard to interpret either side to make them balance. But if you can't, you kind of with great pain in your heart follow what the Torah says and hope that somehow down the road, a better answer will come up. But the questioning is there, the admission that we don't know and that we struggle is clearly out there.
Gloria, that is beautifully said, and I agree with you. Unfortunately, as I said, I have to go, and I really miss the opportunity to hear all of you and all of your points of view, and I look forward to next week. Goodbye.
Okay, so I think
Yeah,
this points out why Judaism is so rich, because we can hold two opinions in ourselves.
Yeah.
And that's the whole point. And that's why the present world situation is so fraught, because there's no respect for the other opinion, and there's no dialogue. It's either one
right. Mhm.
extreme or another extreme. And the being able to understand somebody else's opinion, but not necessarily hold it, gives you a common ground to work with. And I think that's what Judaism's aim was to, or is to meet human needs in a balanced way. So I look with suspicion on anyone with extreme and saying my way or the highway.
Yeah, I wish that was more widely held, and hopefully we'll be able to get to that kind of a place. But I agree with you. Right now, we're not there, and things are very fraught.
I mean, I'm a Baal Tshuva. I came to Judaism to renew my religious life because I thought Judaism had the most moral pathway to give to my kids. Before that, I was basically a secular Jew. So I think these debates among the rabbis are very informative. Some really tried hard to please everybody, and some didn't try at all. And we have to keep trying.
Yeah, we do have to keep trying. Other
That's
comments?
why Carol, along the lines of what you were saying, that's why we just finished a 7-week period because of that a bunch of Talmidei Chachamim didn't give respect to each other. Is precisely why we have that 7-week period. That they died because they weren't respectful of each other.
Right. That's why we do so much counting.
Judy, you usually have something to say.
I I only took pieces of the class, coming here, and then I took a break, so I wouldn't volunteer. I loved what I learned, and uh especially to learn about improving our mido bein adam lechavero now during the times of tzarot for Am Yisrael is really important to heighten our awareness of being kinder to each other, so that Hashem opens the gates of Shemayim of mercy for all Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael, Tzva, Haganah Yisrael, everybody, all of us.
Moshe, Moshe Levison, are you going to be going to the? Oh, you're not there anymore. At least I don't think you are. Moshe Levison, I was going to ask him. Oh, you are. Are you going to go to the you may Iyun next week?
Yeah, I'm signed up for 2 days.
Yeah. All right. So did I. So that's why we're going to take hiatus next week.
Uh,
You know, we're all both of us are going to be going to the Yimei Iyun, which is really 2 days of scholarship. It's held at annually. At least for now at SAR, and it's sponsored by a variety of organizations, and
I
they usually have some
recommend it highly for everybody to come and register.
Yeah,
it's as I say,
there are
some of that.
some really great teachers.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
if you
I
can
mean,
get there, it's Sunday and then Monday morning.
I
you know,
think
I
you
mean,
can stream it. Can you stream it? I think you can, Zoom it.
I don't think so.
No? Oh, maybe I'm confusing it with a different one.
They have a couple of sessions Monday afternoon that you can stream. You have to register for that separately. But the main conference of all day Sunday and Monday morning is not available on Zoom, and it's not clear if it will be available on recordings after the fact.
Oh, okay.
I
But
think
I'm
that
going to the Maharat graduation this afternoon.
Yeah,
Gloria, will you
Um,
be there?
I will not be there, but I will be watching the Zoom and really looking forward to it.
I think the Zooms on Monday are given by people in Israel. That's why they're on Zoom.
That could be. I think also there was a desire to try and accommodate people who asked to make things available on Zoom. So this may have been a way
think those are the
to
ones
try to
that-
accommodate
I
both.
think those are the ones that are in Israel giving the lectures, so that aren't, obviously now they couldn't come here, but they weren't supposed to come anyway.
Right.
everybody. So it was thanks, Gloria.
Thank
That was great.
Yes.
We may,
Wonderful.
and I'm going to send out the schedule. We're almost completely scheduled in terms of what we're going to be doing straight through to Yomim Noraim. We got some exciting stuff coming up. Reb Jeff is going to be doing some stuff. Rabbi Linzer is going to be doing some stuff. Rabbanit Bracha is going to be doing something. So we've got a whole bunch of stuff coming up. So looking forward to sharing Torah with all of you. Take care and, have a good week. We should hear only good news in Israel.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank
All right.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Right.
Bye.